All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Collins, and I am faculty at Western Washington University in the Institute for Energy Studies. And you're here joining us for the speaker series in collaboration with Western Washington University's Alumni Association and Foundation. And we're excited to have you all here today. We have a very special guest joining us talking about transmission and its critical role in powering the renewable energy for the West Coast that's needed to meet our climate goals. And so I hope you can stay with us through the end of the lecture. There'll be a robust questions and answers component, as well as a brief introduction to our final speaker for next week, which is kind of a bonus presentation. So for those students who are here for Energy 391, this will be kind of an extra credit opportunity for you for next week. Don't sweat it. It's not additional work for you. It's just something that hopefully you'll be excited about. But without further ado, I'd like to dive in to our topic today and introduce Kate Griffith, who is a collaborative energy policy strategist, communicator, and facilitator. She spent more than a decade working at the intersection of sustainable community and policy development, and most recently as an energy policy advisor to the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. At the Washington Commission, Kate focused on climate and wildfire resiliency, utility resource planning, rate setting, and the implementation of Washington's new clean energy laws, which center equity in the clean energy transition. Kate previously worked as a journalist and editor in Washington, D.C. and West Virginia, and she earned her bachelor's degree in journalism, English literature, and French language and literature from West Virginia University, and has earned a master's degree in international studies with a focus in energy and climate from the University of Washington. So without further ado, please welcome Kate and take it away.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm realizing after I gave you my bio that I forgot to put in it my current organization where I work, but I'll dive into that as I get into this presentation. I guess, spoiler alert, I'm now with an organization called Gridworks, which convenes and facilitates challenging energy conversations in the West to help Western states meet their decarbonization goals. So as I just alluded to, before we dive into the topic of transmission, which I've spent the last year and a half working on, Sean asked me to spend a little bit of time talking about my career and entry into the clean energy space, especially for the students who I know are on this call. So I'm going to go a little bit into that for a few minutes and then start sharing a slide deck and start talking to you all about transmission policy and development and issues in the West. But in terms of my career and that career path, it's a bit of a winding road, as you probably could have guessed by what Sean mentioned from my bio. I did study journalism in college and spent about 7 years working in the East outside of Washington, D.C. and in my home state of West Virginia, covering a lot of issues at the local and state level, including things like mine safety, state policies, business and economics, housing, health, food security, natural resources, and many other things that you get into as a local and state reporter. But in those 7 years and in that journalism career, as I was talking with folks around issues very important to them and the things that they were working on, I really realized that I wanted to be more involved in policy development than at the time journalism as an industry allowed you to do. Our ethics codes, I don't really know what they are anymore, but when I was in the industry, really disapproved of reporters getting heavily involved with the topics that they covered to the extent of, connecting resources and sources and finding opportunities for folks to collaborate on the issues that we were covering. And I wanted to be more involved than I could be. I didn't want to just be writing stories about what I was learning. I wanted to be actively helping find solutions to solve those challenges. Climate change is a topic near and dear to my heart, and it has been for a while. I grew up in a rural area, although I'm a city girl by West Virginia standards, and impacts of extreme weather were becoming more and more evident, and the connection of increased extreme weather to climate change was also becoming more evident. And I really found it difficult to be talking about those topics in a state that so loves its natural resources and yet is so dependent on fossil fuels. So the issues of climate change, especially in rural fossil fuel communities, were very near and dear to me. So as I again mentioned, doing some soul searching, and as I decided I wanted to leave journalism and switch careers into climate policy, I really took a leap of faith. So that is the start of my entry into the energy space. I applied to one school. I got in and I packed my bags into a tiny Honda Civic and drove across the country to set up house here in Seattle, where I'm based. That time in grad school gave me an opportunity to really explore my interests, to take classes that were directly relevant to the work I wanted to do, to find mentors that could give great advice based on their own personal experiences in the industry. And at first I thought I wanted to pursue climate communications. I mentioned with my history growing up in West Virginia, kind of the challenge of talking about that topic in communities that are very dependent on the economy of fossil fuels. But you know, the more I realized what was involved in that work, again through my classes at the University of Washington, the more I realized that that's more cut out for a personality that's more of an evangelist than I am, someone with a lot more personal strength and persuasive power than I have. Also someone who maybe can take smashing their head against a brick wall over and over again a bit more easily than I can. And I say that having nothing but respect and admiration for the people who do that communications work and do it well. It's simply not something that I'm cut out for. And the reason I mentioned that personality mismatch is because that continues to drive me in my career. So I will share that I did end up leaning on my communications background in journalism to help me with a transition into climate policy work. My journalism experience helped me to land a position as a spokesperson for a state agency handling the nuts and bolts of energy policy. Sean mentioned in my bio, the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. And from there, once I was kind of in the energy world, so to speak, I was able to transition from being a spokesperson and a communications specialist to a role working on public participation in the clean energy transition, along with the other equity provisions from largely the state's 2019 Clean Energy Transformation Act. And for folks who don't know about that act, it does require Washington utilities to remove coal from their portfolios by 2025, to be carbon neutral by 2030, and to be completely carbon-free by 2045. In that role as a policy advisor to 3 governor-appointed commissioners who make up the UTC, I also spent a lot of time delving into energy utility rate cases, wildfire policy, as well as legislative response to more and new clean energy proposals that were headed through the legislature. I will say that that position from being a communications person and entering the policy space did take a few years, and there was a lot of rejection along the way. I often told friends that I thought that I was clawing my way into energy policy as an outsider, not having studied that formally in my undergrad or anything like that. But my search for the right fit and for how I like to work and how I operate, even at the UTC, wasn't quite over. Even after landing a position as a policy advisor to an agency, again, doing amazing and needed and necessary and hard work of the nuts and bolts of the state's energy transition, I realized that it was built around kind of an environment that I'm not cut out for. Commissions, each state in the US has one. They are very litigious spaces. These are built that way by design. and for students in this class, I'm not sure how much Sean has shared about public utility commissions. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but much of the work in commissions takes place in what are called litigated proceedings. And it's kind of like court cases with commissioners presiding as judges and final decision makers in any of the cases that are before them. There are a lot of lawyers, a lot of hardline arguments, and not much room for folks from opposite sides of a case to come together and work out problems in a public forum outside of kind of the protective bounds of legal litigation. That said, my favorite work I was ever able to do at the commission was work that allowed me to bring diverse perspectives together to try to work out problems together. Again, to the extent that's possible in that space and how commissions typically work. So once I was in energy policy, I started looking for a better fit for the personality that I have and the way that I like to work. And I started at Gridworks, my current organization, in 2022 as director of the Pacific Northwest office, where I convene diverse stakeholders in the Pacific Northwest, largely Oregon and Washington, but also westwide for some regional work that I'll speak to in a bit. And we really take on very challenging energy issues and try to find solutions together through mutual exchange of ideas rather than battling it out in a litigated court case. It's a space that I work better in because I know that I don't have all the answers and I don't have to pretend to. And being in a far less legal framework, space where folks are often at odds intentionally has been a much better fit for me. So that was probably more than you needed about my career, but I am happy to answer any questions from that shift, that clawing my way into the energy policy space if you'd like. I think Sean would like me to save questions for the end. So before we do that, I'm going to talk about one of those intractable energy problems and topics that I've been working on over the last year and a half. And this is transmission policy in the West. I am going to try to share my screen. So if you all can bear with me, and Sean, perhaps you could come off mute and let me know if you can see my slides all right when I do this.
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. So before I really get started into the transmission space, I want to offer that this discussion of the need for more transmission in the West, transmission that connects large clean energy generators in the West with the people and communities who depend on that power, doesn't at all negate the need, especially in my opinion, for other solutions to the climate emergency. Whether that's rooftop solar and batteries or other demand-side resources, whether that's sustainable community planning, whether that's cultural shifts that move us away from ever-increasing consumption patterns to a more sustainable relationship with Earth and its resources. I really view climate change as an all-hands-on-deck issue, and we need all viable solutions, not just to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, but also to be resilient to life in this world that we're impacting so heavily. So I just want to say that up front. One common issue in the transmission space is a question, do we really need more transmission if we're building all this rooftop solar? And from my perspective and for the perspective of a lot of folks that are working in this space, the answer is often yes, we need all of it, and we also need more transmission. Okay, so a few points of reference for this talk. I'm going to try not to get too wonky and try to talk about this issue in a way that's approachable. Again, I welcome any questions that you might have to better understand this landscape. I will say, though, that it is complicated. That's part of the issue. When it was created, it was built in sort of a fragmented way, and so our policy landscape is equally fragmented, and I'm going to get into some of the actors in this space in just a few minutes. I do want to give a few more a few more basics. I'm sorry if this is pedantic for folks who know this, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Transmission lines are not the same as distribution lines. So transmission lines, which you'll see on this slide, the metal pole, in short, they are the big high voltage lines that are carrying power long distances between resources and communities. So you might see them as you're driving through the desert, just the pole after pole off in the distance, large metal poles that are carrying power. Distribution lines, on the other hand, are usually what you see in town. Those are often wood poles connecting businesses and homes to power resources. And then a little bit more language around this. When transmission lines are fully located within a state, they're what's known as intrastate transmission with an A, intrastate. When lines cross state lines, they're often known as interstate transmission, kind of like the interstate I-5 connects the states of Washington, Oregon, and California north to south. So the inter piece is important to understand in this landscape of jurisdiction and why developing transmission in the West can be so challenging. So this slide shows a map of the Western electricity grid, stretching from British Columbia to portions of Mexico and from California to Colorado. What you'll see in yellow is broadly termed the Western Interconnect, and all of these multicolored lines crossing through states and provinces are transferring electrical power from generators to customers. Historically, these lines were built to connect our fossil fuel generation with the customers that those fossil fuel plants served, or to connect nuclear power, such as the plants that we still have in California, or obviously the hydropower plants that we have in the Northwest. So one example that you might know about if you have been following the energy space in Washington state for a while, I mentioned the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires the state's utilities to be coal-free by 2025. Up here in the Washington portion, you'll see some east to west or west to east lines. Those were built to connect power coming from the Colstrip power plant in Montana to the folks who use that power here in Washington state. So for example, Puget Sound Energy and some of our other electric utilities were buying power from that plant, or rather had ownership in that plant in Montana, and were using power and connecting power from there to here to serve customers here. So that's one example of a line that had been built in this kind of paradigm, and an example of how the grid in the West is created. There's some color coding here. Lines carry different amounts of power, sizes of power, the largest being more than 500 kV DC lines, and lower voltages are available as well. So the massive interconnection between Western states allows for multiple things, including power sharing. So it's not just a matter of connecting utilities to the power that they have already contracted for. It also allows, for example, sharing between the Northwest. If there's a bad hydro year, for example, the Northwest utilities are able to buy power from other areas to serve customers that typically depend on hydro. Transmission lines have many more benefits. They connect diverse places with diverse resources, which I just mentioned. That offers a bit of backup to the grid when extreme weather hits one place or another. More on the regional diversity, transmission allows for, again, the example of hydropower in the Northwest to serve load elsewhere when we have too much, a large run year, for example. It also helps bring solar resources from the Southwest into cloudier places. It enables access to cheaper power sources. There's many more benefits, but for now, I'm just going to stop by saying it also helps states achieve policy goals. Again, 50 to 70 years ago, when the grid was initially built out, our solar plants weren't necessarily even a blip on the radar. Now that we have clean energy goals and clean energy resources to meet those goals, we have to create new connections between power and people, and transmission will help us achieve many of those state energy policies like the Washington's Clean Energy Transformation Act that folks in the energy space here in Washington are working so hard to meet. So you might be saying, who cares? I see a lot of transmission lines when I'm driving around. We probably have enough of them. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There is emerging consensus in the West that we don't have enough transmission to meet our energy goals. I previously mentioned that the grid was largely built out for technology and needs that we had decades ago. And since then, things have changed. Generation retirements, this refers to power generation changing. So the coal plants that I mentioned in Montana are being retired so that we can be accessing power from other resources. Increased reliance on intermittent resources. I hate this phrase, but I'm going to use it. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. And we need transmission to enable access to power even when the sun may not be shining or the wind may not be blowing more locally. And of course, the issue of extreme weather. Having a larger transmission grid means that if the lines go down in one area, you can reroute the power through other lines and still enable a community to have power to serve them, even in the face of extreme weather causing issues on other portions of the grid. Another major need for new that was not really considered decades ago is or even frankly, a decade ago, is the expectation for a much higher demand for electricity than we've had in the past. Electrification is a big one. As our buildings become electrified, as we stop using things like natural gas to heat homes, as cars stop running on internal combustion engines and move to EVs, as buses move to EVs, all of that becomes a load that the grid needs to serve. And as our states increasingly have goals for electrification using clean energy, that means that we need the transmission to serve those goals. Another one that I love to mention, I don't mean to be flippant, but it's also not a flippant issue, is the increase in data centers and the increased need that data centers have for power to do what they do. And of course, we could joke and say that we're building all this transmission to store our cat videos on the cloud, but it's much more than that. As we all saw through the COVID pandemic, our communications are increasingly reliant on technology and the internet in the cloud. And as more and more stuff shifts that way, data centers are becoming an increasing customer that utilities must serve. So these are just a couple of examples of why we need more transmission. Studies from many of the institutions in this space are also recognizing the need for more transmission. And I'll caveat that we still can't quite yet quantify just how much we need and where. And that quantification piece is a huge challenge that I'm going to get to in a sec. But first, a couple of examples of these studies. The Department of Energy, the Federal Department of Energy, has been conducting a transmission needs assessment that suggests that we have substantial new need for transmission capacity in the West, especially to meet these state public policy goals for clean energy rollout. WEC is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. It's an organization that's very active and important in this space. Also has recognized that there's growing risk associated with our lack of transmission, especially growing resource adequacy risks, which means, will we have the power to serve the load that we need when we need it? And then CAISO, which is a transmission planner out of California, also recognizes in their plan the need for substantial new transmission to serve the California state coming up in the near future. I also want to flag that Washington State has specifically flagged the need for more transmission to meet the state's clean energy goals, both the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which had those specific non-emitting targets for utilities, as well as the Climate Commitment Act that was passed a few years ago. So one document that has come from state policy is what's known as the State Energy Strategy. That is housed, I believe, in the State Department of Commerce, which is our state energy office. And they have highlighted the need for transmission investment and state agency engagement in transmission discussions. A quote from a recent update to that energy strategy shares that constraints in what's called the bulk power transmission system pose one of the greatest challenges to Washington's energy and climate goals. And Washington must take deliberate action in coordination with its neighboring states, I'm paraphrasing a bit, to expand transmission capacity and ensure it can affordably and reliably meet its clean electricity goals. There is a lot of work in this space happening within the state. I'm going to be speaking mostly to the regional efforts, but I do want to share that another state agency working in this space is called the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council, or FSEC. And they released a report in 2022 looking at strategies for enhancing transmission development to meet Washington needs and more. So if there's this sort of large recognition of the need for more transmission, why aren't we building it? It's a very good question. There are a number of barriers to transmission development in the West. The first is planning. It's the quantification piece that I've been mentioning, how much transmission is needed and where. The landscape for transmission planning in the West is fractured, and this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of my time. But I want to quickly mention two other very large issues for transmission development in the West as well. One is cost allocation, and this term is largely just corresponding to the fact that these are expensive pieces of infrastructure, costing millions to billions of dollars. And they're expensive lines, and folks can't agree on who will pay for it, or how they will pay for it, or when they might put up the money for it. And so the cost issue is a major impediment to transmission development in the West. And then siting. Siting is a topic that folks are soon turning to, I think, in the energy policy space broadly. It can take, I think I saw a recent estimate, 17 years to get a line sited. So let's say it's gone through the planning process. It may have a payment paradigm where folks have agreed to pay for some aspect or another of the line and its upkeep. Even after all that happens, it can still take years to get that line built because of all the federal, state, and local permitting processes that every line has to go through before it's built. I'll share that in the West, there's a significant amount of federal land. So, of course, we have the national parks. We have marine sanctuaries. We also have a lot of Department of Defense land. And I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to share this, but I'm going to anyway. I heard a story recently of some transmission that was planned for the Southwest US. And planners initially had it going through some DoD land, Department of Defense land. Turns out that was a missile testing facility, and the consensus later was maybe a transmission line should not be sited to go through Department of Defense missile testing facilities, and they had to reroute the land. And then, as I guess I'm kind of alluding to, permitting is jurisdictional by jurisdictional. So the question is often asked as the permitting processes get underway, what's the benefit to me in hosting this piece of infrastructure, especially if the power isn't necessarily planned to serve my community. So a lot of challenges with community benefits, a lot of challenges with the environmental process, all of which are important topics to talk about. And I don't mean to call them challenges as if to say they should be ignored. It's simply a fact of the matter that it is hard to site a transmission line even after it's been planned. So to summarize all of these barriers, some might call them a murky quagmire of jurisdiction. There's so many different agencies and activities and so many different authorities and very little cooperation between any of them. I mentioned I'd spend most of my time on transmission planning. And again, that's the quantification piece to a large degree, and a good example of the myriad interests that are involved in the transmission planning. So how is transmission planned in the West? A number of ways, to say the least. One utility might decide it needs a transmission project and work to build it on its own. If it's a utility that's only serving one state, that just means that they need to go through a state planning and permitting and siting processes. If it's a multi-state utility, there's still the multi-state issue at hand. Utilities can also partner with another utility, and maybe together they determine that they have a mutual interest in exploring development of a line. There's also federal government interests that play a hand in this, and the federal government plays a role in transmission planning in a couple of ways. First, if you, again to the class, if you are planning to do any work in the Pacific Northwest energy space, you'll soon learn of an organization, if you haven't already, called the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA. And BPA operates our hydropower dams and owns and operates much of the transmission in the Northwest. A recent estimate we saw was about 75%. It's a standalone federal agency and a very important actor in Northwest energy policy. The other organization listed here is WAPA, or the Western Area Power Administration. It's another power administration, a federal standalone organization, somewhat similar to BPA. It's less relevant to the Pacific Northwest, so I'm not going to spend too much time on WAPA here. There's also FERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission with regulatory power over interstate, again, crossing state lines, transmission of natural gas, oil, as well as electricity. And in 2011, in an order that a lot of folks refer to, well, it is the FERC Order 1000, and people just call it the Order 1000. FERC set up a requirement that utilities undertake interregional planning between state lines, transmission planning through what were called regional planning organizations. And this is key to the issue of transmission in the West, these organizations have not developed any new transmission projects outside of California. The final piece on this slide, merchant transmission, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but long story short, these are lines that are developed by private developers, but not utilities, who then sell rights to use those lines to either generation or to utilities and access to the line and capacity to the line. But for now, I want to go back to that FERC Order 1000 and the Order 1000 organizations. There are three in the West, and you'll see them on the slide. CAISO, or the California ISO, is in California in pink. There's Northern Grid in purple and West Connect in green. And Northern Grid covers Washington and much of the, well, all of the Pacific Northwest, while West Connect is largely focused on the interior West and the desert Southwest. So just a quick look at who these organizations are and the areas they cover. And now I want to offer kind of a grade that they'd been given for their transmission planning efforts, especially interregional efforts, by a very well-known organization, NGO in this space called Americans for Clean Energy. You'll see in this grade that CAISO fares fairly well in the grading, but Northern Grid and West Connect did not. So I'll give a little bit more context about that. So in 2003, all of this, all of this background coming to my point, I suppose. In 2003, my organization, Gridworks, really sought to understand what is going on with transmission in the West. Why aren't we building what we need, and what can we do about it? We launched a West-wide effort called the Western States Transmission Initiative that convened regulators. So these are the folks in the energy commissions in Western states, as well as energy offices, through an organization called CREPC. There's a lot of acronyms in the energy space. My apologies for just dumping them on you. CREPC is the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, if I got that right. And it's largely a Western convening of all the energy regulators and energy offices in the West. So with them, we partnered to explore this question, what is going on with transmission development in the West? And through this effort, we interviewed stakeholders, more than 40 organizations throughout the West, what they thought about both the transmission planning and the cost allocation piece, who pays for it. And again, folks widely agreed that transmission development in the West is insufficient to meet the many goals and services that it can provide. Regional transmission planning, again, widely panned outside of California, largely because there was no meaningful interregional or interconnection-wide planning. The organizations essentially, stakeholders say, did what they wanted to do and weren't very forward-thinking and certainly weren't planning across a West-wide footprint. They were very focused on utility-specific footprints. Cost allocation, again, a major impediment. Who's going to pay for it and how are they going to pay for it? Utilities themselves, they're large companies, but the cost of transmission can be even larger to some degree. And many utilities, especially the smaller ones, that make up here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of consumer-owned utilities and co-ops. They lack the resources to build big projects on their own. And that's not just true of consumer-owned utilities, it's also can be true of investor-owned utilities. Our stakeholders determined that state and provincial coordination really has a large role to play in transmission development, but that more resources is needed and help is needed. And then again, the federal utilities, BPA and WAPA, have a large role to play in that interregional coordination element. So what's happening? What happened after all of that learning and those conversations? Well, some positive momentum after all that doom and gloom. Folks are mobilizing. So following our work with CREPC, the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, that organization has set up a working group to keep exploring both planning and cost allocation together. We're continuing to facilitate them in those efforts. West Tech is an organization of utilities and Western advocates, NGOs, who are frankly undertaking a first of its kind Western transmission plan that will take a look at not just state by state footprints or the CAISO West Connect Northern Grid look, but really at the West on a whole to see what corridors are needed, how much transmission is needed, where might these transmission lines go. And that is not an effort that has been conducted certainly since before FERC Order 1000 came out in 2011. I think FERC has recognized some of the challenges of the state of transmission. It certainly recognized some of the challenges of the state of transmission and has some new orders directing interregional planning and potentially cost allocation pending. And we're hopeful to see those orders coming out this year. The Federal Department of Energy has been doing a lot of work to support transmission planning, including the work that I mentioned at CREPC and at West Tech, as well as conducting several high-level national studies on the need for new transmission nationally and in the West. Perhaps of interest to folks in the class, and I'm not sure where you all are hoping to take your careers. This type of conversation had not often been something that state and local advocates participated in. It's a murky space, as my presentation has hopefully shown, and there's a lot of technical nuance that goes into these conversations. But more and more state and local advocates are hearing the call of what we heard in the Washington State Energy Strategy, that in order to meet the clean energy goals that they have been working so hard for, they need to be more active. We all need to be more active in building out the transmission that we need to support those goals. And so many organizations, and I'm working with some in Oregon through an effort called the Oregon Clean Grid Collaborative, are focusing on ways that people that are more used to advocating with their communities can come into these more regional spaces and start having their needs heard there as well. Finally, I didn't go too much into what an RTO is. This is another acronym standing for Regional Transmission Organization. I probably should have had a map showing this, but long story short, these are kind of one-stop shops for transmission planning, interregional transmission planning, and discussions on cost allocation. And many other parts of the country have them. They exist in the Midwest, the MISO RTO. Well, actually, I guess it's an ISO, but anyway, MISO in the Midwest is one, PJM in the East, quite a few. The West likes to be special, and we have not organized ourselves into an RTO outside of the work that California does just for its state footprint. That said, there is growing recognition that perhaps formalizing state cooperation outside of all of these myriad other acronyms I've shared with you might be helpful. And through a project called the Pathways Initiative, some regulators, NGOs, and others are exploring pathways to bringing us all together more formally into a regional transmission organization. So I think I'm nearing time and want to leave space for questions. I just wanted to highlight one kind of example of the transmission challenge in the West. I've mentioned a lot of need for transmission to connect us with more well-known and understood resources like on-land wind or solar power. There's also a large exploration recently to find new resources that can meet the generation potential of some of our fossil fuels and large generating nuclear plants, things like that. And these are new, untested technologies that haven't been deployed to the scale that we really necessarily understand all of their implications. That said, the federal government does have an effort underway to test and deploy these new technologies. One of them is offshore wind. So this is a very controversial topic. I'm just going to start by saying that. And it's controversial for a very good reason, largely because of that untested nature. Folks don't understand fully what the impacts of offshore wind will be in our offshore ecosystems, what the impacts would be to migratory species, what they would be to fisheries, which are massive employers and industries and important spaces up here, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. But the U.S. federal government, through an agency called BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, in California and Oregon, are exploring offshore wind development on the West Coast. That formal federal process has not yet begun in Washington, although the state is considering how it might want to engage in this process through the development of a planning and evaluation framework that I'm also involved in and happy to talk about if you have questions. So even as we have through our national energy policy, these goals to achieve certain amounts of offshore wind by, I think it's 2030, there is no transmission largely that would link this huge generating potential to our onshore grid. Transmission along Oregon and Washington coastal communities is few and far between. People often describe them as kind of at the edge of the line. They're the last people served by utility lines. And community benefits, again, of the siting of this new major infrastructure, especially if that offshore wind power isn't even necessarily coming to these small coastal communities. Lots of concerns. It's very unclear. So offshore wind, many folks hail it as a potential opportunity to really help us make a dent in the amount of generation we need to meet our clean energy goals. Still faces, despite all of those challenges of just the power siting itself, planning, cost allocation, and siting challenges for any transmission that might connect offshore wind to the Pacific Northwest grid. So with that, I'm just going to stop with that example. Sean, happy to take any questions that you might have. Folks, I also want to let you know I've agonized with Sean about this ad nauseum. I am not a technical person, so if your questions for me are how many gigawatts or anything like that, probably I can't answer it, but I'm happy to point you to resources that could better answer it.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. We've had a lively sort of discussion and Q&A occurring and as you've presented. So we've had some folks weigh in on some of those technical questions. And we've generated a significant amount of interest here from your presentation. And we have a limited amount of time, so we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions. So I'm going to take the host privilege here of picking out a few that I think will be helpful. One is specifically looking at retrofitting existing transmission lines that may have provide potential to have increased capacity. To what extent is that part of the conversations that you have been a part of?
Yeah, that's a super major part of the conversations. We don't have, frankly, well, we can't have transmission conversations without folks bringing that up. And a lot of them are advocates in this space. So there are many studies that are looking at reconductoring options. And for the West Tech study and others, many folks asking exactly these same things. So reconductoring, expanding existing rights of way, adding lines to rights of way, all are important. And there's also technologies, grid enhancing technologies, and I'm not going to get deep into those, but they enable a better look at what the grid is actually doing at any point in time so that operators can better align their operations to what's happening on the grid, whether it's weather systems or other things. All of those are very important pieces of the conversation and things that folks are taking very seriously. Again, just don't have the quantities yet to know how much of this can be solved by reconductoring and others and how much really needs new transmission lines. I think I forgot to mention many of these studies that are being conducted, and I didn't even mention all of them. There's another one called Connected West are looking at these issues, and DOE is looking at these issues. And these studies should be published sort of segmented through this year. So hopefully we have more information on some of those topics in 2024.
Thank you. And we had a number of questions, I think, about kind of the cost. You talked about cost allocation, and then we were looking at the public utilities, the consumer-owned utility, and then the investor-owned utilities. I guess very broadly, when looking at this, where have the discussions landed in terms of impacting affordability when it comes to transmission lines? Has that been a material part of the conversation?
Yeah, and I'll speak to the affordability piece first, and then maybe you could tell me again the differentiation question there with the consumer owns and the investor owns. I don't think I was quite tracking that one. Affordability is a major concern. These lines are, again, millions to billions of dollars to construct. And the paradigm of how much it impacts ratepayers depends on whether you are served by an investor-owned utility or a consumer-owned utility. Investor-owned utilities, again, are regulated by state energy commissions, but there's this notion of a regulatory compact where they are private companies subject to state regulation, but also afforded the opportunity, not the guarantee, but the opportunity to earn a profit on the services that they perform. Versus consumer-owned utilities are what they sound like. They're consumer-owned. Examples of them might be Tacoma Power, Seattle City Light. There's also co-ops in more rural areas. And of course, I'm sure we could all argue about what our energy bills look like and whether or not our city municipals are spending money appropriately, but they're not earning a profit on the services that they provide. They're providing them supposedly at cost, including the costs of their employees. So all that just to say, different paradigms, an opportunity to earn a profit might be attached to investor-owned utilities, but the costs of transmission are a huge concern for policymakers. And frankly, in my opinion, and rightfully so, a lot of the reason of some of this hesitation to really move forward gung-ho on transmission development in the West, because they know that at the end of the day, someone has to pay for the transmission. And that someone, to some degree or another, is going to be through our energy bills. We are all going to be paying for this infrastructure. And folks are very cognizant of those impacts and very concerned. Lots of discussion about how those costs can be equitably distributed. Again, though, it's not just state by state, like within your utility commission. These arguments are also happening at a regional level. So how much burden is one state willing to bear if they're not receiving most of the benefit of these lines? And also might be hosting more of the physical line itself. Huge concern. And I don't have great answers. That's literally what folks are hoping to dive into through some of our regionalized conversations over the next few years.
Thank you for that answer. I see a number of people here who are looking to have some follow-up or learn how they can get it more engaged. Are there clearinghouses or specific resources that you might call attention to where people could follow and track this conversation about progress on climate goals, on more on this transmission line conversations? Is there a couple spots you would recommend?
Yes. So for progress on climate goals, I'm not sure which particular goals you're thinking of. There's a lot of climate goals. Washington State regularly reports on its state laws, provides updates to the state energy strategy. And I would start maybe with the Department of Commerce. They typically house a lot of these reports. I'm happy to share some links with Sean maybe after this talk. I don't know if you have an easy way of disseminating those links, but if not, I would start with the energy strategy. Just Google it, energy strategy, Washington State Department of Commerce. And a lot of documents will show up, including updates that they have to provide from the legislature. And then those documents will also have links to all the other resources that are tracking this. I guess I should have offered, unfortunately, there's not one great clearinghouse that I'm aware of. Maybe others have more ideas. I kind of operate in the like the state energy policy space. And state policymakers are not well known for having great clearinghouses of any sort of information, and this is definitely one of them. That said, the California Energy Commission is a good source if you're interested in California's energy goals. The Oregon Department of Energy is a good source if you're interested in Oregon's clean energy goals. And then, of course, we don't have region-wide goals, but we do have national goals. And I would go to the U.S. Federal Department of Energy to learn what those are. I've been babbling on that one for a long time. How to track the transmission conversation. So you're welcome to go to my website, gridworks.org. We have some information on that Western States Transmission Initiative there. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions on how these things are unfolding. The CREPC work has a CREPC page under the Western Interstate Energy Board. Offering agendas and PowerPoint presentations for the work that the CREPC transmission work is doing. For West Tech, that West-wide transmission planning study, you could go to the website of an organization called the Western Power Pool, which is kind of the host organization pulling together this study. And then there's a number of listservs that I don't have a great answer to get you on, but if you wanted to contact me, I could see if I could help you get on them. So my email it was on our slides. It's kgriff@gridworks.org. I will caveat all this by saying that, again, it's a really wonky space, many, many acronyms, many references to other organizations, and it can be a little bit hard to follow. But I'm happy to answer questions if you are diving into these materials and you're not really sure what's going on, or at least point you to folks who might be able to. The group of advocates I mentioned in Oregon, the Oregon Clean Grid Collaborative, I wish that I was aware of something like that in Washington State. Unfortunately, I'm not. But there are a number of NGOs that work in Washington. The Northwest Energy Coalition is one, Renewable Northwest. Oh my gosh, Sean, I'm so sorry. What was the
I
name?
I think
Uh,
those are two fantastic organizations there.
but
Uh,
what was the name of the one you were working for?
the Energy Project.
The Energy Project? I don't think they're super involved in this, but anyway, Renewable Northwest and Northwest Energy Coalition would be good touch points to understand what's happening in these spaces.
Kate, thank you so much for your time
Yeah.
and sharing your experience and your knowledge. I think we could go on for another hour having this conversation and answering questions. Unfortunately, we're tied to our class time here today. Um, for everyone in attendance, we have one more of these sessions that will be kind of a bonus session next Tuesday. We are pleased to present Amory Levins, the longtime chief scientist at Rocky Mountain Institute and co-founder. So please tune in for that. And then we'll have a new spring quarter full of presenters. Look forward to continuing the conversation here. We'll continue to be on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. And Kate, thank you again for all of your time and expertise, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.